the two major textual variants, and that's all there are, when you talk about major blocks of text, 12 verses each, what's called the pericope adulterae, John 7:53 through 8:11, the story of the woman taken in adultery. We've discussed that a number of times. And then the longer ending of Mark, or the shorter ending of Mark, or the medium ending of Mark, or the combined longer ending and medium ending with the freer logion in Codex Washingtonianus, and some mixtures of these things that we have in various families and of Greek manuscripts as well as translations. Entire books have been written on the subject. Here's one called Perspectives on the Ending of Mark, 4 views. David Allen Black, Darrell Bach, Keith Elliott, Maurice Robinson, and Daniel Wallace contributed to that. There are other works that are of less value because of their strong bias or prejudice that they bring. And so there are 2 major variants. And as we've said many times before, when you address the issue of the amount of evidence, there is much stronger evidence for the antiquity of the various endings of Mark than there is for the story of the woman taken in adultery. So if you are a majority text advocate, if you're a person who counts manuscripts and just wants the majority numbers on your side, then you're going to hold to the longer ending of Mark and reject the interesting addition from Codex Washingtonianus called the freer logion. But there are a lot of folks who are re-examining, they're examining for the first time this issue, having only heard about it secondhand from other people. And so, for example, some of the comments that were made, and this wasn't just this is in an article actually that someone had posted, was about how pretty much every manuscript of Mark contains this ending. How could you delete it? When in reality, the issue is extremely complex. As far as being deleted en toto and just not being there, you do have Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, and you have a manuscript called 304. You also have manuscripts both in Syriac and the Sahidic Coptic, which likewise do not contain anything there. And both Eusebius and Jerome mention, in their opinion, and this is just an opinion because, in their opinion, the majority of manuscripts in their day did not contain this. How do they know? Again, there was no mechanism in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries to collate manuscripts. It's tough enough today when you got people flying around in jet planes and going to libraries that have numbering systems. It's hard enough even for them to come up with a meaningful catalog of the manuscripts. It was impossible in that day to do so. And so when an early writer like a Jerome, because Jerome made many comments, as did Eusebius, but Jerome especially on the text, when he talks about the majority of manuscripts, the majority of manuscripts that he has seen, well, how far did he travel? What manuscripts were available to him? Would that be different from the area around Eusebius? This kind of majority of this, majority of that type of thing has to be taken with a grain of salt. But the point is, when we talk about the Gospel of Mark, we only have a small amount of papyri testimony to the Gospel of Mark. P45 contains Mark, but it doesn't contain the last chapter. And that's one of the problems with many of the papyri, is that many of them will not contain either the first or last chapters of a book or collection of books. And it's that last chapter that's in the biggest danger, especially in papyri manuscripts, in having been damaged or ripped off, or just the ravages of time. So unlike John, which has the greatest amount of papyrological testimony to it, and the earliest, we don't have papyri manuscripts of Mark that go to the end of the book. And so we have to go with the earliest that we have, and the earliest are Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, as the earliest testimonies. But then what's interesting is we have wide variety of information from the translations. There are divisions amongst the translations as to whether they contain it or don't contain it, or what they contain it, how it's translated. And there are so many variants that what is very, very plain is that even though the longer ending becomes the standardized ending in later centuries, if you were to look at the situation up through about 600, up through Codex Washingtonianus, because Washingtonianus is really weird along those lines, and it's the archetype of the Byzantine text type itself when it comes to the Gospels, though it has some interesting variants. What we have is a tremendous amount of discussion and confusion about the longer ending, about what the ending of Mark should be. So when people talk about, well, there's just such overwhelming evidence, how do you define overwhelming? If you're a manuscript counter, well, yeah. But that just means you're a Byzantine text advocate, and that also means you shouldn't use the TR every place, because every place the TR disagrees with the majority text should be amended. And if that's the position you hold, great, you're being consistent. Fine, wonderful. This new movement isn't consistent at that point. That's where the problem lies. One of the problems lie. But for someone to say, I've been lied to all this time, you haven't been lied to. You may have been ignorant, maybe didn't do enough reading, didn't listen closely enough. But let's make it clear so everybody can understand. The vast majority of Greek manuscripts, the Gospel of Mark, that contain the ending of Mark, there's a distinction there, have an ending, normally the longer ending, but there's a shorter ending, and then there's like I said, the Philologion and is got to be thrown in there someplace too. You can't just throw Washingtonianus out the window. At the same time, during that time period, there are major differences between the translations that were being made at that time, Sahidic, Coptic, Bohairic, so on and so forth, as to what their archetypes, the Greek manuscripts from which they were being translated, what they contained, whether they contained the longer ending of Mark or not. So no one is lying when they say that the earliest manuscripts do not contain it, because we only have a few, and that there is serious reason to question the originality of the longer ending. The serious reason is not based upon majority text perspectives, because that's not how the vast majority of Christian scholarship functions. They have not been convinced by the argumentation that that is how you should do things. You have to answer the question, why could Jerome say what he said? Eusebius say what he said at that time period? Why do you have early 4th century codices that do not contain this text? Why do other early fathers never mention material from that passage? That's an argument from silence, but it is a relevant argument when you're asking about whether this was even known to them in any way, shape, or form. And most importantly for me, why the differing endings if the one is original? Normally the answer is, well, in some early manuscripts it fell off, and so it was only transmitted in one line. Okay, I'd like to see the early evidence of that. Given the nature of the ending, it certainly strikes me as being something that was cobbled together from other sources and does not flow naturally from the Markan narrative at all. But none of the endings do, for that matter. So it is a highly complex textual variant. If you can write entire books on it, it's highly complex. And people have taken different perspectives on it. But to emotionalize it and to weaponize it, I guess that's the big new term these days, is to weaponize something. To weaponize it as an argument for a traditionalist perspective, and to basically say, well, I was lied to. I was lied to my entire life. And maybe you misunderstood. Maybe you didn't do your homework. But the vast majority of later manuscripts contain the longer ending. But that's not the issue from most of modern scholarship. We already knew that. That was a given. The question is, why do these earlier manuscripts not contain it? Why do these earlier translations demonstrate that there was confusion about it? Why are so many, even into the later portion of the first millennium, manuscripts have asterisks and obeli and marks that mark this off? Why is Codex Washingtonianus out there waving a red flag around? These are all questions that we can address, but once you accept a traditionalist text position, why are you even talking about it? You can't be convinced by anything. Your epistemology excludes any type of textual critical argumentation that could be derived from early translations or anything else. You have your text. It's there. That's it. There's no reason for you to argue about it. But you just need to be open in telling people when you're promoting this, I'm not basing this upon textual critical argumentation. I'm basing this upon a theological paradigm that I've developed. Unfortunately, most of the time, you all still want to throw that other part in, even though you've actually rendered it irrelevant by your argumentation, which is a strange thing.